All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first partner webinar for the 2023 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. My name is Joe Spolko. I'm a hydrologist here at the National Water Center, and I'll be giving a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Greater Mississippi Basin, Souris River, Red River to the north, and the Great Lakes Basins. We will also hear from representatives from each of the 5 river forecast centers for more detailed information on the flood potential for those respective regions. Then this year, we've moved to a story map format to make the briefing more efficient and visually pleasing. We will be providing an official avenue for internal and external partners to provide feedback beginning with the webinar 2 weeks from now. And then the email reminder you received about an hour ago has a link to a PDF copy of the story map if this is easier for you to follow along with. And then the webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with key message information, a link to the story map and a PDF copy of the story map and the recording of this webinar. This will likely be sent out by close of business today, but at the latest will be sent out first thing tomorrow morning. Should you have a question during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address it at the conclusion of the presentations. All right, so let's dive into the data here. So we're going to start by taking a look at the winter precipitation so far this season across the Greater Mississippi Basin. Here we're looking at the past 90 days accumulated precipitation percent of mean. And what stands out is that portions of the Missouri Basin and upper Mississippi Basins have seen around 150 to 300% of mean precipitation over the past 3 months. And that's shown in those green and blue shades, but still not quite enough to bust the ongoing drought across the Missouri Basin. Much of the Arkansas Red Basin is seeing below normal precipitation, especially across the upper portions of the basin shown in those warmer colors, while the lower portion of the basin is seeing around 100 to 150% of mean, shown in those green shades. So altogether combining to suggest potential for a near normal flood risk. And then much of the Ohio Basin has been near normal. And finally, the lower Mississippi Basin has been near normal to above normal for precipitation amounts, especially across Louisiana and Mississippi, shown in those darker green colors. So this has worked to prime conditions and increase the flooding potential, as you'll see throughout the webinar. So we can tie this precipitation into our soil conditions across the basin. Compare the current Climate Prediction Center soil moisture ranking percentiles, which you see here, to this time last year. So here's 2022. We can see that the overall dry soil moisture conditions for the middle Missouri Basin continue into 2023, while the far upper portions of the Missouri Basin are seeing more near normal soil moisture conditions compared to the very limited soil moisture that was in place at this time last year. Also note that across the Red River of the North Basin, there is less soil moisture currently locked into the frozen ground compared to this time last year, shown here for 2022. And this could potentially help to somewhat reduce the flooding threat across that basin. Across the far lowest portions of the Mississippi River Basin in Louisiana and Mississippi, we've done a complete flip, generally speaking, from last year, with dry conditions in place at this time last year, here shown in 2022. Then if we look at 2023, soil moisture rankings are above the 95th percentile this year. So this is likely going to enhance that efficient runoff and potentially enhance the overall flood threat for that region. So considering the recent precipitation and soil moisture conditions, let's take a look at how this has impacted the USGS stream flows compared to historical flows for all days of the year across the Greater Mississippi River Basin. And really the main story we're seeing here is that the lower Mississippi Basin, particularly across tributary rivers in Louisiana and Mississippi, are showing above normal to much above normal flows in place, which makes sense given the recent rainfall and wet soils in place there. This has increased the flooding potential across the region, but ultimately it will be dependent on future rainfall amounts. And then portions of the Ohio River Basin are experiencing near normal flows, maintaining that near normal flood potential for the basin at this point. And then elsewhere across the Greater Mississippi Basin, we are seeing near normal to below normal stream flows, which may potentially mitigate widespread significant flooding impacts. And we did want to point out that across the northern tier, you don't see basins highlighted and it just shows those blank white basins. This is due to the seasonal gauges not taking measurements and or being turned off, as many of them are iced in for the season. So moving on to drought conditions now, and looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor. Across portions of the lower Mississippi River Basin, drought conditions have improved and just about completely disappeared compared to this time last year in response to the recent wet weather pattern the region has seen. So here's 2023. And if we swipe to show 2022, you can see the drought conditions that were in place across portions of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi last year. And then further to the northwest, drought conditions have worsened across portions of the middle Missouri Basin compared to this time last year, which will be yet another limiting factor to widespread flooding potential across that basin. And now we'll focus more on the wintry aspects of the outlook and discuss temperatures, snow, and ice conditions across the basin. First focusing on the past 3 months average temperature departures from mean, which in complete contrast to last year. So here's 2022. This season, shown here in 2023, we have seen negative departures from mean across the Missouri and upper Mississippi basins, with much of this being in response to the cold air outbreak we saw in December 2022 across much of the region. And really the main impact of this is going to be on the river ice conditions. We have seen river ice formation across portions of the Missouri and upper Mississippi basins already, which is going to increase that risk for localized ice jam flooding. And now looking at the current snow water equivalent across the basin, there is snow cover across a majority of the upper Mississippi basin and portions of the Missouri basin, with generally normal to above normal total water content in the snowpack there. There is around 2 to 6 inches of snow water equivalent in the eastern Dakotas, much of Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, into the UP of Michigan, all available for melt this spring. And Mike at North Central River Forecast Center will dive into more detail on this shortly. There's pretty minimal snow water equivalent across the Appalachians and portions of the Ohio River Basin, so snow and ice may not play much of a role in the spring flooding this year. But this is only the first webinar and things can change a lot between now and the heart of spring. So we'll just have to continue to monitor trends. And then we did want to point out that the snow water equivalent you're seeing across portions of central Oklahoma, eastern Kansas, and western Missouri is a little bit overdone. This is going to melt out over the next few days anyways. So this snow water content is not likely to be impactful. Now comparing the current snow water equivalent shown here to the snow water equivalent at this time last year. The biggest difference that stands out is that there isn't any snow across the middle Mississippi Basin through the Ohio River Basin this year, whereas last year there was quite a bit in place. So this void of snow water equivalent may decrease the potential for widespread significant spring flooding. And then further west across the Missouri Basin, we see an increase in the aerial coverage of snow water equivalent this year in comparison to last year, which could locally increase the runoff into the smaller tributaries in that region. And across the upper Mississippi Basin, we see about the same aerial coverage this year, but slightly higher amounts. Now changing gears to look forward to the next week of precipitation. There doesn't look to be widespread significant precipitation over the next week. However, some of the forecast precipitation you see here in the upper Mississippi Basin is falling as snow. So that's going to add to the snowpack up there and increase the total snow water content. And then the rainfall amounts you see across the lower Mississippi Basin and lower Arkansas Red Basin are a combination of light rain that's expected tomorrow and then additional rainfall that's expected early to mid next week, which we will be watching closely, but for now, doesn't look to be overly concerning. Now we've made it to the long range portion of the overview, so we'll be bringing into context all the past and ongoing hydrologic conditions and how future temperatures and precipitation across the greater Mississippi River Basin may or may not produce flooding impacts heading into the spring. So here we're looking at the Climate Prediction Center 8 to 14 day precipitation outlook. where probabilities are leaning towards above normal precipitation across much of the greater Mississippi Basin, and especially across portions of the Ohio River Basin where the antecedent soil moisture and stream flow conditions were near normal, if you recall. Now taking a look at the Climate Prediction Center 8 to 14-day temperature outlook, probabilities lean toward above normal temperatures along and east of the Mississippi River, where there isn't a whole lot of snow available for melt, with exception to portions of the far upper Midwest. And then probabilities favor generally near normal to below normal temperatures west of the Mississippi River, where portions of the upper Mississippi and upper Missouri basins may continue to develop river ice if the below normal temperatures do actually end up coming to fruition. And if we look even further out through February and into March and April at the Climate Prediction Center's seasonal precipitation outlook, probabilities lean toward above normal precipitation for portions of the Ohio River Basin and upper Missouri Basin, and near normal to below normal precipitation elsewhere across the basin. And as always, this will be very important to watch as flooding susceptibility in many locations across the greater Mississippi Basin is driven by convective rainstorms, which are typical in the springtime. And keeping our focus on the same time period, but now focusing on temperatures, probabilities either aren't showing a clear signal or are favoring above normal temperatures, particularly across the far lowest portions of the Mississippi Basin. There's no indication of a prolonged warm-up across the northern tier, though, which is good in terms of mitigating widespread flooding impacts from snowmelt. Then we want to briefly shift focus to the Great Lakes region and provide an update there, where we are not expecting impactful levels this year. And in summary, the Great Lakes water levels are running normal to slightly above normal and are projected to remain with about a foot or less of normal into spring and generally below the 2022 levels. And then finally, to summarize all of the ingredients we've discussed here and see what this means in terms of actual tangible river flooding, we can look at the long-range river flood risk outlook valid through early May. The flood risk across the greater Mississippi River Basin remains near normal for this year, meaning that minor to moderate flooding is possible this spring. And the flood risk across the lower Mississippi tributaries in Louisiana is above normal for minor to moderate flooding this spring. And now I'll pass it to Jim Knoll at the Ohio Basin River Forecast Center for more details on that region.
All right, thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. As Joe is kind of showing, we've had above normal temperatures this winter, and that is likely to lead to early vegetation and reduced runoff in the Ohio Valley. So even though, as Joe is showing, that we are forecasting, NOAA is forecasting above normal precipitation in the Ohio Valley into spring, some of that's going to be offset by above normal temperatures and above normal evaporation and evapotranspiration out of the soils, meaning a little bit reduced runoff. Also, again, we do not really have any snow or ice concerns at all, and we don't really foresee that into the spring flood season. So therefore, we are expecting a normal flood risk in the Ohio Basin, and that means, again, minor to some moderate floods, especially in the lower Ohio Basin over the next 3 months. If we move on to the next image, one of the things we like to do in the Ohio Basin is, since rainfall is the dominant factor in what occurs in the Ohio Valley as driving the spring flood conditions, we like to look at the 25% chance of what is possible. This is usually a pretty good gauge. And again, this looks pretty normal to us. This is a typical 25% chance that we'll see. And so we're going to focus in on the red dots, and those are the moderate floods, because that's usually when we start to see more impacts. And again, these are pretty much what we normally would see. In Ohio, Killbuck Creek is forecast to go to a moderate flood. In West Virginia, I'm going to be continuing to highlight a few of the bigger ones here. The West Fork and the Coal River are forecast to go to moderate flood. Further to the west in Indiana, the White and East Fork of the White River are forecast to see some moderate flooding. On the White River below Indianapolis, on the East Fork of the White River below Columbus, Indiana. A few additional rivers in southwestern Indiana that will likely reach moderate flood stages would include the lower Wabash River and the Patoka River. In southeastern Illinois, we foresee the Little Wabash Basin seeing some moderate flooding, but again, that's typical for this time of the year. And finally, down into Kentucky, we see some scattered moderate floods across Kentucky, including the main stem Kentucky River itself, the South Fork Kentucky and the Red River, and in western Kentucky along the Green and Rough Rivers. Over the next couple of weeks, on the last slide that I have, we are just beginning to see some signs of risk of some minor flooding in our western and northern basin from southeast Illinois through Indiana to northwest Ohio. But again, very minor flooding over the next 2 weeks between now and our next briefing. So the bottom line here is that we are expecting a normal flood risk, some minor to moderate flooding. So overall, I got pretty good news for the Ohio River Basin. And with that, I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over to Mike Wilvert up at the North Central River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Jim. And taking a look now at the area covered by North Central River Forecast Center, that includes the Hudson Bay drainage, as well as Western Great Lakes and also the Upper Mississippi. Overall, in our area, we're going to classify our risk for spring flooding to be about normal as well, all things considered. Perhaps there might be a few areas where the risk is just a little above normal, maybe across parts of Minnesota into western and northern Wisconsin. And maybe the risk is a little below normal in a few spots, such as lower Michigan, parts of Illinois, parts of northern Indiana. In those areas, they don't have as much snow on the ground right now, as Jim mentioned too. But for locations that do experience flooding this spring, we expect the majority of that to be of the minor category. So if you look at this plot here, you can see that we have a few sites that are red, only 6 of them. And those are suggesting a greater than 50% likelihood for reaching the moderate flooding level at those, and only about 70 sites in total that indicate a greater than 50-50 chance for minor flooding, those indicated by the orange there. So all in all, about average for our area. Although we do have a good deal of snow cover on the ground, especially from North Dakota and Minnesota up into northern Wisconsin and the UP of Michigan. Joe showed that earlier. Limited frost and the underlying dryness should allow for the melting snow to actually infiltrate into the ground, and that should reduce our runoff and keep the threat for widespread significant flooding down this year. On the next image, we're going to look at the snow water equivalent ranking as we had in our modeling system as of Monday. You can see here that we do have ample snow cover across North Dakota and Minnesota, reaching up into northwest Wisconsin there. The snow water content is generally between 2.5 and 4 inches for most of that area. There are some 5 to 7 inch amounts closer to the Lake Superior snow belts. This snow water ranks in the top 10 or 20% of our historical record. So generally above normal amounts of snow water for this point of early February. Meanwhile, from eastern Iowa over to eastern Wisconsin and into lower Michigan, you can see the yellow, orange, and red colors. That indicates snow water content that is well below normal for this time of year. They had some warm periods in January that melted away most of the snow in those areas. And only within the past few weeks did they see snow cover reestablish itself, including today's system, which is adding some snow and rain to the mix. Where you see the gray there on the map, there's no snow on the ground. So we do have some snowy areas, but as we move to the next image, we're going to take a look at frost depth. And frost looks like it may play a big role for us this spring. As you can see, looking at this map, as Joe zooms in there, there's not a great deal of frost out there this year. Much of the area that does have frost, it's about a foot or less. And in talking with some of our frost observers across the upper Midwest here, the frost that is around is generally soft frost. You could push a stick or maybe a ruler into the ground without too much trouble. That kind of frost tends to go out of the ground rather quickly when it warms up. And it also allows for at least some of the water to soak into the ground. The only areas that show deeper frost are located in western and northwest Minnesota up into North Dakota. The frost there is a bit more solid, but that also corresponds to the area where soil conditions going into fall were the driest. So despite having some snow on the ground, when we do get our melt, we expect some of the water to be able to infiltrate into the soil and maybe be retained in other off-channel storage areas that have also been dry. So this overall looks to reduce the runoff potential across our forecast area. For these reasons, we anticipate generally a normal risk for flooding this spring, only a few pockets where the risk is slightly above normal and a few where it's a bit below normal. And any area that does see flooding should most likely be only of the minor variety. But of course, future precipitation over this next 6 to 8 weeks, as well as how fast our snow does melt, those are going to be key in how the overall flood risk evolves this spring. And with that, I'm now going to pass it off to Kevin Lau down at the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll start off by saying that there is an overall reduced flood risk across the Missouri Basin for this spring. Only a handful of the 400 plus locations that we forecast have an above average flood risk, while the majority of locations have a near normal to much below normal flood risk. About 1/4 of the basin, centered primarily on the northern plains, has a flood risk that's been reduced from normal by anywhere from -10 to as much as -30%. And this can be expected because the Missouri River is entering its 3rd year of drought. The latest drought monitor that was released this morning has 63% of the Missouri River Basin categorized in some level of drought. The previous 3 water years, water year 2020, water year 2021, and water year 2022 are the 10th driest, or is the 10th driest 3-year period in the 125 years of record keeping. But even with this dry condition, as this graphic shows, we do expect some flooding this spring, and it's predominantly in the minor category. Specifically, we are looking for minor flooding along the North Platte River in Wyoming, the James, Vermilion, and Big Sioux Rivers in South Dakota, the Grand and Sheraton Rivers in the state of Missouri, and along several of the smaller tributaries feeding the Missouri River located in extreme eastern Kansas and across the state of Missouri. The Missouri River itself could experience on again, off again minor flooding downstream of Kansas City due to the episodic thunderstorm activity that is typical for the spring. Despite the incredibly dry soils across the bulk of the basin, we thankfully have a healthy snowpack this season, both in the mountains as well as in the plains. And this should be good for water supply, but I don't think it's going to be a worry for flood risk. With our next graphic, we'll be looking at the mountains, and this graphic is courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and it shows by sub-basin the snow water equivalent percent of the 30-year average currently in place in the mountains west. Mountain snowpack can be generally categorized as being near to slightly above average for this time of year. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated about 70% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountains. So what does this average to above average mountain snowpack mean for spring mountain runoff? Well, that's what our next and final graphic will depict. This graphic depicts the expected April through September runoff volume from the mountains. Our latest water supply outlook that we issued last week indicates a below average runoff year for the mountains west, with the exception of the North Platte Basin, where we expect a slightly above average mountain runoff year. But even with this slightly higher than average runoff year for the North Platte, as I mentioned earlier, we are currently outlooking only one location on the North Platte River to experience flooding this spring. As was mentioned earlier in today's briefing, the Northern Plains has quite a bit of plain snowpack, with 3+ inches of snow water equivalent being reported in the eastern portions of the Dakotas and northwestern Iowa. Though an above average plain snowpack year, we don't expect significant flooding to result. Not only are the soils still very dry from the ongoing drought, but the existing plain snowpack has also precluded the development of a deeply frozen ground condition across much of the plains area, as Mike mentioned for his area. But we do expect minor flooding, as I said, along the James, Vermilion, and Big Sioux rivers and South Dakota. At this point, I need to interject a word about ice jam flood risk. Despite low water conditions, or maybe because of it, river ice has already presented challenges within the basin this year. River ice has resulted in elevated stages along the Gallatin River in Montana, the South Fork Shoshone River in Wyoming, and along the lower reach of the North Platte River in Nebraska. Thus far, impacts from these western freeze-up jams have been minor and localized. The bitter cold snap, which draped the basin in mid to late December, also resulted in ice jams in the lower Missouri River, one in the Nebraska-Iowa reach and the other in the reach below Kansas City. Neither condition resulted in flooding, but both jams resulted in setting record low stages in the stretches of the Missouri River immediately below the jams. Going forward, we do believe that we have a below normal risk for ice jam breakup flooding this season, but as long as we have ice in the rivers and as long as we have snowpack on the ground, the risk does exist. Thunderstorm activity drives springtime flooding in the southeastern third of the basin. And I'll hasten to add, though, that we've only experienced 2 minor flood events this water year. So since October, we've only had 2 floods, and both of those were in the state of Missouri. The almost complete absence of flooding in the southern portion of the basin since October, 4 whole months, is very impressive. That shows just how dry we are. To summarize then, spring flood risk in the Missouri Basin is reduced from normal this year. And again, I'll repeat, we do expect minor flooding along the North Platte, the James, Vermilion, and Big Sioux, the Grand and Sheraton rivers, and along several of the smaller tributaries feeding the Missouri River in the state of Missouri. The Missouri River itself below Kansas City could see a couple of locations go above flood stage as well. Thank you, and this concludes the Missouri River portion, and I'll now pass the mic on to Becky Harjo at the Arkansas Red. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. The long-range outlook for flooding in the Arkansas and Red River basins is near normal. It's going to be pretty close to our expected climatological risk of river flooding. But moderate and minor river flooding are expected on the Neosho, Poteau, and Illinois rivers in eastern Oklahoma, which is expected because these rivers typically have greater than a 50% chance of flooding every spring. We're also expecting some minor flooding on the Arkansas River and its tributaries this spring, including the Fushlapov and the Petit Jean rivers in Arkansas and the Spring River in Missouri. Minor flooding is also expected on the tributaries to the Red River, including the Glover and Little rivers and the Clear Boggy Creek. And the flooding in these locations also pretty much represents the climatological risk of river flooding. Now, we currently have some ongoing moderate and minor river flooding on several of the rivers I just mentioned. However, these rivers will be crested in the next couple of days, and the higher flows will move through our river system soon, so that the current river flooding today doesn't mean that there's going to be an enhanced chance of river flooding throughout the spring. So now, taking a look at our snowpack, the snow water equivalent in the headwaters of the Arkansas River Basin is currently below normal. The snowpack in this area typically peaks towards the beginning of May. And the snowpack in some of the more southern headwaters of the Arkansas Basin are well below normal, currently down the range to 30 to 50%. The snow water equivalent in the headwaters of the Red River are also below normal, and these basins are currently running about 80 to 85% of normal. And looking at our reservoirs, the reservoirs and both the Arkansas and Red River Basin currently have about 99% of their total flood control storage available, so they're in great condition to hold any flood waters they receive this spring. And the reservoirs in the lower part of the Arkansas River system and the lower part of the Red River system also have more than 90% of their conservation pool still full. So now I'll turn it over to Jeff Groschel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center to talk about their area.
All righty, thank you, Becky. As far as our area is concerned, it's a kind of two tales. One, for the Mississippi River itself, we've recovered a lot of the water that we had from record low conditions that we had in October, and have certainly got away from that period on the lower part of the Mississippi and lower parts of the Ohio. Based on what's going on upstream on the Ohio and the Missouri and the upper parts of the Mississippi River, we're really just looking at normal flood conditions and flood risk for the lower part of the Ohio and the lower part of the Mississippi River. It's a little different story though as you go further south. We've had a pretty good amount of rainfall over the parts of Louisiana and Mississippi that Joe had mentioned earlier in the briefing. Had another round just last night across these areas as well. So the flood risk especially for the portions of the Calcasieu River and southwest parts of Louisiana, Amite, Comite river systems in southeast parts of Louisiana, the Pearl, Big Black river systems in Mississippi, all of those rivers really have probably a greater flood risk for minor to moderate flooding across those areas. Now, we'll also have to kind of watch things closely as we work our way up northward. We had a pretty good amount of rainfall, 2 to 5 inches over parts of Arkansas and stuff. If we continue to have that over those areas and stuff, that flood risk may increase across those areas as well. But right now, the focus is really lower parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and the rest of the remainder of our area, we're looking at mainly just normal flood risk for this year. Minor to moderate flooding is typical for our area just in any year, but that risk is increased for the areas that we've had pretty heavy rainfall. And just like a lot of other areas and stuff, really that rainfall is going to be really the key for the final outcome for that flood risk for winter and this spring. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Joe.
All right, thank you. Thank you everybody for those great briefings. So to summarize the potential impacts for the greater Mississippi River Basin spring hydrologic outlook for this initial update, the flood risk across the lower Mississippi tributaries in Louisiana is above normal for minor to moderate flooding this spring. The flood risk across the Souris and Red River basins is normal, meaning that minor flooding is possible. The flood risk across the eastern Arkansas Red Basin is near normal, meaning that minor to moderate flooding is possible this spring. And then the flood risk across the Ohio and Mississippi River basins is generally near normal, meaning that minor flooding is possible. And then overall, there is a reduced risk for flooding across the Missouri River Basin. So this concludes our presentation. If you have a question for any of our presenters, please utilize the question box on the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address your questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, we have a question from Jerry McRae about La Nina. What's the La Nina? So La Nina is still ongoing, but it is expected to start weakening over the coming months. And the expectation of our Climate Prediction Center is by midsummer, we should be back into neutral La Nina conditions.
All right, we're not seeing any more questions, so I think we're good to go here. So thank you for your time and questions, everybody. There will be a follow-up email that'll be sent no later than tomorrow morning with information about this webinar. The next partner webinar will be on Thursday, February 23rd, so be sure to tune in. And we will send out reminder emails next week with all of that information. All right, so thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.